yet here he is, you know, out and with us, available to share his story. And just his presence here with us tonight is a real victory. It's a victory for him, obviously, but in the bigger picture, it's a victory for all of us here and anyone that's a person of goodwill and wants real change in our country. So we're really glad about how it's turned out for Zolo. So Zolo and I decided we want to dedicate this program, and we want to dedicate it first of all to the 1,491 people who've been executed since 1976. We want to dedicate it to the 25 political prisoners who are still in U.S. prisons. Zolo is a former political prisoner. And we also want to dedicate it specifically to Kathy Boudin. You may have heard that 2 days ago, Kathy Boudin, who is a former political prisoner, she spent 22 years in New York State prisons for her participation in the Brinks robbery, along with the Black Liberation Army. But that's what gets in the news. But Kathy was a lifelong revolutionary and a social justice activist from the time she was young until she passed. And so we're thinking of her today. So, okay, so now what we're going to do is we're just going to jump into it. I'm going to ask Zolo questions, and our idea, we'll see how it goes, is we'll do that for about a half hour, and then there will be about a half hour for Q&A. So, all right. Just a little background to this first question. The circumstances of Zolo's arrest are that in 1981, the Gary National Bank in Gary, Indiana, was robbed. In the process, there was a shootout, and a policeman, Mr. Yaros, was killed. There was a chase with a car, and then after a little while, near his house, Zolo was picked up off the street and charged with murder, and that was the beginning of the story. During Zolo's trial, Zolo did not receive a fair trial. There was a lot of injustice that occurred. In fact, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned Zolo's death sentence twice due to unfair practices on the part of the prosecution. So, my question to you, Zolo, is can you tell us about the bias and the unfair practices that took place during your trials?
Well, it's typical. My case was not unique. It happens all the time. The way things develop, I received a lot of attention, and I had already been like a so-called local notoriety or celebrity type individual, because I won art shows. I'm an artist, painter, writer. I was honed my skills in art and painting while I was in prison. I had been incarcerated prior to that. So, so I think that it'd be better if you would ask me more questions, because I may have I got a habit of going from a tangent sometimes. I say things that's relevant at that point, but you may have to go back and ask me a few questions to clarify some things. But my trial was actually a circus. It was a show trial, and I was held up as a sacrificial lamb for the movement that was going down. I mean, when I'm going down, it was a slow, it was not as fashionable or popular. And I was a member of a clandestine unit at that time, and I declared myself a citizen of the Republic of New Africa, and I refused to acknowledge or accept that the state had the right to put me on trial. So as a result of that, I was considered a terrorist, and whatever happened, happened to me, rather. And so it was a large police presence. They had snipers on the roof. The police lined the courtroom from wall to wall. My attorney was so afraid and intimidated that my attorney wouldn't even sit next to me during the trial. He sit like down toward, we had a longer table about 3 times as long as this, and he sit like partially close to the middle or almost to the end. I was at the end of the table here. So to communicate with him, I had to write notes on a legal pad, and I would slide it down the table to him, you know. So this went on through the whole trial, and it was just an experience. But I was willing to accept that. I was willing to make that sacrifice. I did not. I expected it. It was something that I had been trained and conditioned myself to be tortured. How much I would be able to withstand, I did not know. But fortunately, I was not tortured because the police thought that I had more support, community support that is. I had more support than I actually had, but I didn't. I'm glad they thought that. And but the trial, it was something I never experienced before. But I've seen it and heard it and read about it happening to other people. So I just not see myself as unique at that time.
Okay, so Zolo, you touched on the one thing, one reason why the Indiana Supreme Court overturned Zolo's death penalty sentence was the fact that you had, as they called it, ineffective counsel, which you just described. Then there were a couple other things about evidence and the nature of your jury that were reasons that your death penalty sentence was overturned. Can you speak to those things just a little bit?
Well, one thing in particular is that once the trial got underway, well, we had to pick the jury, and that I had an all-white jury. My attorney would not object to anything, and when I tried to say something, the police grabbed the pistols like I'm ready to do something. So I'm sitting here, I'm saying, now, how can I do this and make it out alive, and then make the record to be able to come back on appeal, come to effect an appeal. So I had to be a little crafty at things. I would raise my hand, and, you know, and I would deliberately move slow, and you know, I would blurt things out at times when there was a lull in what was going on, and I would say something where the microphones would pick it up. I did things like that.
Okay. So, Zolo was tried on the death sentence actually twice, because in Indiana the way they do it is you actually, when you're sentenced to death, you actually have a trial on that sentence. So going into the second trial just on the sentence, were there issues with suppression of evidence and the nature of the jury and how they didn't allow certain people to be on the jury in Fort Wayne?
Yes, clear for our point, it's called a bifurcated proceedings. You have, in that case, that came about as a result of the struggles of prior to 1967, where at one time, if you was found guilty, it was automatic death sentence. So that became under a strong scrutiny from people that was in the streets, whether it was SDS or other groups that was protesting in the streets, and there were people who was facing charges and resistance just for any type of crime that was committed or just for criminals, for example. It was used primarily terrorists, as they labeled me, and that's what it was used for.
Okay.
But the bifurcated proceedings was a trial for the guilt phase, and then there was a trial for the sentencing phase. So it made the judge and the prosecutor looks like, well, it's out of our hands, it's in the jury's hands, so you can't really say that we are being prejudiced and discriminatory towards you. So this is the jury speaks with the voice of the community. So when the jury recommended the death penalty, it was only a recommendation only, but that was just an excuse for the judge.
So I'd just like to add that moved the trial from near Gary, Indiana, which is a largely black city, to Fort Wayne, Indiana, which has 1/3 the number of black folks than Gary has. Not only that, it was discovered with finally really good lawyers that Zolo had from the People's Law Office in Chicago. These are radical lawyers who defend political people. They discovered that the jury pool, well, the way the jury pool was formed in Fort Wayne, they were not drawing for the jury pool from a significant part of the black part of town. And so then that came to light, and that actually became a reason why the second time the Indiana Supreme Court overturned the death penalty sentence, which is, that's incredible. And and the prosecution said, oh, sorry, that was due to a computer glitch. And as someone said when we were talking about this morning, oh yeah, you mean a computer glitch that started during the Civil War. So question 2. You alluded to the fact that you were in prison previously. And so I want you to go back just a little bit and tell us what was the path that led you to be a socially conscious prisoner?
I always have been a loyal person. I was loyal. I was loyal to my friends. I was loyal to my word. If I was with you, I was with you to the end. Even though my mother, I used to get in trouble. My mother said, well, tell him what happened. Well, I don't know what happened. So my mother couldn't get it out of me, so that's how I was. So even though I was doing wrong, as a teen, as just young, juvenile, and then as a young teenager, I was involved in gang activity. I was a leader of a gang. I became a leader. I did not seek that role, but I was always active. I stayed active. I did not drink. I did not smoke. I did not do anything that you associate with someone that's being out there in the streets and committing crimes, so to speak. People trusted me, and I ended up going with somebody, and I committed a home invasion in which somebody got killed. I was 18 years old. But prior to that, it was a lot about the social conscious activity going on in the streets. And I always had it in my mind about what was going on. And I wanted to know, how can I fit into that? But it didn't work out that way. But I always had it in my mind. So I ended up pleading guilty to that charge. And I did 7.5 years in prison. But that's when my re-education process started. Because while I was in prison, I was a young 19-year-old young man. And I knew right then from what I was seeing, I had to grow up fast. And you didn't have as many young people in prison at that time. This is in 72 to 74. You didn't have that many people in prison at that time. You had some, but not as many. It was mostly older adults. Maybe they are middle 20s to their early 30s. And I was in Pendleton, Indiana State Reformatory. That's right outside of Indianapolis. So I met some Black Panther members who was arrested in Indianapolis. So I used to watch them, how they exercise, how the guards would respect them, but they didn't like them. And I said, I want to be like that. But, you know, as an immature child, not knowing how to actually be a man or to introduce myself, I would slowly sit into a chair or go out to the drill ground. We call it the drill ground or the recreation yard. And I would sit close to them, then I would start moving closer to them, like, you know, some bench or something, and I would listen to them. Eventually, I was being noticed, and then they would start talking with me. I would exercise with them, but while we exercising, they would give me literature and give me books to read. But I couldn't hardly read that well. I'd get the book, and then I'd keep it in the cell for a while, then I'd give it back to them, then they asked me some things about it, but I really couldn't say anything. I'd just say, look, I'm just ready to fight. But eventually I went to lockup, and while I was on lockup for a charge, I caught a charge in prison for aggravated battery on the guard, the sergeant. But I was helping somebody else because he was choking the man. So nobody was doing anything, you know, so I just grabbed him my book and I hit him in the head and knocked him out. But but the sergeant was so hated within the cell house, it took over a day and a half before somebody actually told on me. And at that time, they had a policy that if you come to the rescue of a guard, then you'll be automatically get parole. Well, somebody eventually did it, and they got released. So that's how I caught the charge. And while I was on lockup, I started studying deeply. Then I learned that, well, I put it this way, I learned how to live with myself. I learned how to acknowledge my mistakes. I learned how to admit when I was wrong. Exert myself as try to be like a righteous human being, you know, a civilized person that can have a positive influence on my condition. And I tried to do whatever it took to better myself. I used to get these terrible headaches because I was trying to read and I wasn't wearing my glasses. So I used to be like the class clown. And so one night I had a headache that was so bad, I started screaming. And I started screaming, I couldn't stop screaming. So then, this guard on the lockup unit came down to my cell, and he was in front of me like, what's wrong? So I was screaming, and he said, what's wrong? And I was trying to tell him to hold on for a minute. Just hold on, but I was just, and then when I finally started to come down, it was almost like I had been running, and my heart was beating real fast. And I said, I'd like to have some Tylenols. He said, is that all? I said, yeah. So he came back with a styrofoam cup, running over Tylenols, and he gave me some. Well, I was so embarrassed because I'm in the cell and all my friends is hearing me. And I had realized I had went somewhere, but wasn't sure at the time where I went. But I had realized that I was actually going insane. And that's when I stopped making fun of people. I used to make fun of people I thought they was kind of off, you know. And it's a thin line, and pain can drive you insane. So when some of my friends, and I was, at the time they had a program called treatment. And I had already been in the hole for 17 days. And then at the time when you're in the hole, you was in total darkness. Your toilet was like a hole in the floor. And you couldn't see. They gave me bread and water, and sometimes they would give me bread and milk, or they would give me a bologna sandwich, a piece of bologna between bread. At first, I wasn't eating anything. I didn't trust it. After a couple of days or almost a week, I started eating it. And they would give me a styrofoam cup, and that would be my cup that I get everything. Whatever I get, water, coffee, or some milk or something. And they open the door, I stick my cup out, they put whatever is in there. It was a double door. They shut it back, I'm in total darkness. And I have my cup laying, sitting down. And there's a sink in there. But you can hear the cup fall over. Well, a cockroach had crawled in it. It was a big cockroach, and they knocked the cups over. And It was cold in there. It was cold, or if they turn the heat on, you burn up. And then you have a choice, freeze or burn up. Freeze or burn up. And I started having sinus problems after that. So yeah, those things, it made me harder because they was doing wrong. But I was told that the police didn't do no wrong. The police were the good guys, officer friendly. Everything that I was taught in school was a total contradiction. So now, being the person that I was as a child, I'm coming into my adulthood, it made me even more harder, made me even more focused, made me even more stronger. Now I want to do something about it. I was a person of action, and now I want to do something right. And doing something right means that I have to go against anybody who is committing wrong, and that's what I did.
Okay, so, and actually regarding what Zolo is talking about, you may know that Amnesty International has classified solitary confinement as torture. You know, so you were tortured, actually, probably more times than that. But thank you, Zolo, for that. Really very powerful, very moving. And so I want to continue on that thread. That last thing you said, I know that you were resistant throughout your trial. You fought for yourself legally, and throughout your prison experience, you fought for yourself and others. You were resistant. You developed into the person that you just said you developed into. So, and then, you know, regarding the relationship with the Black Panthers, and I know there were people from other groups, you referred to reading. Can you tell us more about things you did, actions you took as a resistant, as a socially conscious prisoner? What were things you did with other people, you know, like the studying you've told me about, or, you know, more of the things you engaged in prison as a socially conscious prisoner?
One of the books that I read was, where it began with Blood in My Eye, that somebody gave me. And I struggled through that book, but what made me want to actually increase my education and to study in earnest was when I had a hard time reading a letter that Jonathan Jackson, that was published in the Blood in My Eye, that Jonathan Jackson had written to his brother George.
Who wrote Blood in My Eye?
George Jackson. He was a prisoner in California, in Soledad. But his brother, Jonathan, was 17 years old. At this time, I was 21. And I'm like, what are these words here? So it was like a personal embarrassment to me. So I had this little dictionary, and I would read every other word, go to the dictionary to find out what that word meant. And that was one of the reasons why I started getting them headaches, because I was reading so intensely. And at the time, this program that was government, Department of Corrections program, which was done in all the prisons, was called treatment. You had to be locked up for a certain period of time in that cell. You only came out maybe twice or 3 times a week for a shower, like for 15 minutes, 10 minutes. You back in that cell. So I had been locked in that cell for over 30 days. And, you know, so the walls was closing in on me. And I had to learn how to mentally deal with that.
Yeah. So then, the things you were studying, like, what did you study, and how were you able in prison to even have the literature? And how did you get together with other people to discuss the political things that you ended up?
Prison is a microcosm of the society. What was going on the streets, it filtered inside of the prisons. And there was a lot of people coming in who were not common criminals. I was seeing people who was college graduates. I've met people all over the world. Professors. I've met different type of teachers. People from all walks of life. I met them in prison. And I learned about some of their cases and of why they was in prison. And when I was reading Blood in My Eye, and I also read Soledad Brothers, what was being done to me had been done to George Jackson. And so I was looking at what he was doing to deal with that. So I started writing. I started reading. I started writing poems, poetry, just writing my thoughts down, and that was therapeutic for me.
Okay. So you were on death row for 27 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long time. And I know you've told me, you saw others walking down the walk, on their way to no longer being with us. And so, so what was it like on death row, just like personally, and when that kind of thing would happen, what was your response, other people's response? But then also in the larger picture, how do you see the death penalty? Your thoughts on it? Like, what is the purpose of the death penalty in the United States? But how about the personal thing first, and then like your political thoughts on it?
I was prepared to sacrifice my life. I was prepared to give up my life. And at the time, we had a policy of self-imposed poverty. I gave up all my worldly possessions prior to my arrest in 1981. I gave up all relationships. I severed all contact with my family. I lived a dual life. I lived a secretive life. I was the spook that sit by the door. And at the same time, I still organized. We had meetings. I did a little traveling. Everything was clandestine. So I was prepared for it. I was prepared. I was prepared to deal with that.
Okay. So, in recent years, mass incarceration, solitary confinement, inhumane practices that exist within prison have really gotten a lot of attention, and that's positive. Unfortunately, there are still 2 million people inside prisons in this country. We are, by far, there are more people in prison per capita in the U.S. than any country in the world. And we have more people just in numbers, any country in the world. So you lived through this. You went to prison in the early 1980s for the charges that we're mostly talking about. And you've seen, the development of prisons and who went to prison, how many people are in there. So how do you see this issue of mass incarceration? And really, I heard someone say the other day, use the term racial capitalism. That's one way to describe our society. Well, I think it should actually be changed to, mass racial incarceration because of the nature of prisons. Anyway, so you saw this whole thing go on in the drug war, people in for minor offenses. So what do you have to say about this issue of mass incarceration? You saw it happen before your eyes. In
prison, they don't care if we find out what's going on. For example, the drug war. There were people in prison who was involved in that I knew. But the police was always part of it. The police was always part of that. There was no secret what was going on. As far as executions, we organized on death row. And everyone that was executed, I knew them when I was there. But they told us they held some dignity. They died with dignity. But each one of them wanted us that was still alive to keep fighting. So each time a person was executed, we drew more strength from that. And we got to say, we got to remember Jamu, we got to remember Zion. We can't stop. You have to keep going. And I had different strategies and tactics that I would use. And one of the strategies and tactics I would use is to not try to reinvent the wheel. So, and don't use the same thing that everyone else is using. We would use, we have an issue, for example, about the jury. Well, we attack the jury from many different angles when we file our appeals. And what the Indiana Supreme Court would do, they would deny my appeal, then they would deny your appeal by using my case to deny your appeal, and they kept doing it. It's a game they was playing. And all of it was designed so they can take and justify using the death penalty.
Okay. So you were victorious, even given all these challenges that you're sharing with us and what you went through. You're victorious over the criminal justice system. You're here and you're with us today. So what were the ingredients that allowed you to have this victory, would you say?
I used some of the strategy and tactics that the Panther 21 used. And I used the law against them. I used the law to defend myself. I used the 13th Amendment, and I explained it in my appeal what the 13th Amendment was. And I said that the death penalty took lynching from the back alleys and the dark woods and brought it out into the open and gave it a different face, but it was the same thing. This is a lynching. And when I did those things, the judges, they lost control. So sometimes I wanted my appeals because the appeals courts, the Indiana Supreme Court made mistakes themselves. Because they couldn't control themselves. They were too busy trying to justify their own actions and defend themselves against the Constitution. The 13th Amendment especially.
Okay. And then, so, I would just add, as I said before, finally, because partly because Zolo was a political prisoner, a person committed to transformative change in this country for black people and for all people throughout the world. People from the People's Law Office in Chicago came to support him, Michael Deutsch, among others, and that was really a big part of what helped. And of course, as we know, many people in prison, if not most people, aren't in a position to get, legal help that's so supportive and effective. And then, would you say that outside support, like the support you got from the committee that I was a part of and other people who supported you, did that have something to do with, how things came out for you?
Yes, if you go back and see the pattern and practice of people who was lynched, when lynching was like a common everyday thing, what they would do, they would first isolate you. Sometimes they would put you in jail, then come back later that night and the sheriff would turn you over to the mob and they'd take you out in the woods and put a rope around your neck and pull you up in the tree and just they hang you. Well, the same thing takes place in the courtroom. And when they can isolate you from the community, deny you community support, deny you an effective defense team, then they can have their way with you. Yeah. But see, because of you and others who was picketing in front of the prosecutor's office, who was lobbying the news media, lobbying different politicians, and coming to visit me on a regular basis, taking turns and coming to visit me, that someone's always looking at me and checking on me, they kind of like want to make themselves look good.
Okay. Right. Okay. So the final question, then we'll open up for Q&A. There's still 25 political prisoners in prison. Leonard Peltier, Sundiata Kohli, Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rap Brown in the SNCC days, to name a few. So Why is it important to free the remaining political prisoners?
It's important because they have made the ultimate sacrifice, and I don't want to throw out names as far as criminal cases and like throwing somebody on the bus and then stepping on them to raise myself up. But the political prisoners, they serve more time than the common criminal. And while we was in prison, that's the type of life I don't wish on anybody. It's a barbaric. It's like when I first went to Pendleton. Let me go back on them. Come back. When I first went to Pendleton, Pendleton was the Indiana State Reformatory. The prison officials had an open policy, and they would allow us to kill each other. And it goes on, and nobody's. They just allow us to kill each other in the open. So we would organize, try to hold down the balance, and then you had the white prisoners, the Mexicans, then the Puerto Ricans, and then you had the white Caucasian prisoners, then the North American prisoners, then you had the new African prisoners or the black prisoners, and everybody was separate. But when we started showing that this is a game that's playing to control the prisoners, it's a game. And once we began to organize and pull it together, then we start being even more effective. You see, it's not lino. We have to. It's inclusive. And our ideology was, or our theory was, to transform the colonial criminal mentality into the revolutionary mentality. You see, and we want to see, and people that we say, look, you're not a bad person. You're a good person, but when you expect to be treated a certain type of way, you conduct yourself a certain type of way. You see, so and that's how we did it. It was effective. SDS. I'm gonna put this in. SDS. I did not realize the significance. We used to use what happened at Kent State on May 4th. Those of us that was more willing to fight, we physically fight, take up arms. Once we got to that point, we used what happened at Kent State as a definitive example of why we cannot stop, and we must escalate. That was the purpose. Because if they go in and gun down those white unarmed students who's protesting against a war someplace else, and we fight no war here, then there's no doubt about it. We're gonna be right. And then years later, I got choked up the other night. We was in the restaurant because when a particular person asked me about, how I come in, involved in, when I came here, I kind of I couldn't hardly get it out, because here I am, when we were talking about SDS, and now I'm with SDS. I'm here. I'm meeting the people who we were studying at the time I was in prison in 1975 and 76.
Because you told me that some people came in, were incarcerated, and they brought in literature about what happened on May 4th, what happened at Kent State.
Because
right?
It wasn't on television.
So you're referring to that. So
look at television.
So what was that literature, and say a little more about what that?
Periodicals, newspaper clippings. We just had some was handwritten papers that someone wrote while I was in the county jail, and another person gathered it, and we would read it, or something that was typed up on a manual typewriter. The information got to us.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so does anyone have a question? If it's something Zolo's touched on, but you might want to hear a little more about it, or a whole other topic that might be related to what Zolo was talking about, feel free to ask a question.
So, when you were in prison, did you vocalize your innocence? Did you talk about, that you were wrongly accused, incarcerated? Was that something that you talked about, or is that dangerous to do?
No, that's a good question. I'm glad you raised that because I was innocent. I knew something about the bank robbery, but I was innocent as far as shooting at police officers. I did not shoot them, but that's not what the law. That's not what the law. It's just a matter of whether you're guilty or innocent. It's a matter of whether you was before the due process. At first, yes, I was innocent, but the more that I presented evidence of my innocence, the more I was losing. I kept losing my appeals. I kept losing. I won a few victories later, but I kept losing initially. And the reason I was losing is because it's not about guilt or innocence, which people don't realize that. All that the law requires is that a defendant in a criminal case receives a fair trial and not a perfect one. For example, in 1991, October, November, somewhere in that area, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the case of Herrera versus Collins, a case out of Texas, in which a Mexican man was charged with killing a police officer. He was on death row. He had execution date, he was granted a stay of execution. His case went to federal court, and it was overturned. No, it was denied. It was denied. So the case went through the whole process, but he came back and filed another federal habeas corpus petition, raising his issue of innocence. There were two detectives who had originally investigated the case and found out that they made a mistake. So the two detectives contacted his lawyer and said, "We made a mistake. It was his brother who actually committed the murder." They presented all the evidence to the court. They won. The case was overturned in federal court. But the district attorney, the state attorney general, appealed the case, and it went all the way through to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a defendant or petitioner is allowed one bite at the apple. This came after, was it after the Timothy McVeigh case or before? But anyway, they ruled that he had a fair trial, he had a fair hearing before, and he was allowed to file one habeas corpus petition. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it is not unconstitutional, I'm paraphrasing, it is not unconstitutional to execute the innocent found guilty properly. So it is not unconstitutional to execute the innocent found guilty properly. I had started talking to my attorneys. I said, look, let's stop talking about my innocence. I said, let's go at them on the due process violation, and we're gonna put the state on the trial as a state-sponsored terrorism, and we're gonna go to not the United Nations. The United Nations done sold out. We're going to the Organization of American States in South America, which we did. And so first the state was trying to say that this is a criminal matter. It has nothing to do with another country getting involved in the in American internal affairs. No, this is not an American internal affairs. This is a human rights issue, and we won on that. And so that was how I got out of prison. I got out of prison because we made a deal with the state. He said, look, if you drop your request for the death penalty and stop calling me a terrorist, then we would drop our petition in the Organization of American States. So we dropped our petition. The state dropped their allegations of terrorism, And they also dropped the death penalty eventually. We was picking the jury. We was picking the third jury. I didn't know they were going to drop the death penalty and just let it go, but they dropped the death penalty with a stipulation.
That's right. Zolo raises a good point that he was on trial twice for the death penalty, but the state pursued it for a third time. And then there was this agreement that Zolo talks about. So they actually tried to execute Zolo 3 times. The state of Indiana did. So any other questions?
What was the stipulation?
The stipulation was that I would not plead guilty to anything, and that I would sign a contract, and the judge had nothing to do with it. I signed a contract, and the contract says that I will allow the state to separate my charges. I was only facing 60 years maximum. By that time, I had been locked up 29 years, something like that, almost 30 years. So I was going to be released soon. So to keep me from walking out the courtroom, and the pressure that came down, we had international support too, and the pressure that came down on the state, it would not look like we was forcing them to release me as a victory for the people. So I agreed to an extra 10 years.
Right, 10 years. Zolo spent 10 more years in jail, or prison, I should say, as part of the final agreement.
And I would be able to challenge the rest of my appeals in federal court. Well, I went to federal court, but I ended up getting a judge who was from Lake County. He came out of retirement because when you had the crack cocaine, powder cocaine disparity, a lot of federal judges were stepping down because they took power from the judges. If a woman was this affected my case. If a woman was with her boyfriend and they found some drugs in the car, and they would charge both of them as with possession. If she don't tell on her boyfriend, then she's going to get, or her husband or whatever, she's going to get time too. So if she was facing 50, 60, 20 years in prison. So the judges would say, no, you don't deserve that at that time. You didn't have anything to do. I'm just going to give you 5 years, maybe probation. Well, the government was appealing, and they was taking it back and they was admonishing the judges to follow the federal sentencing guidelines. Well, when the judges would start stepping down, that was like a tacit rebellion on the federal court, on the judiciary. Well, my judge that I had got on my habeas corpus came out of retirement to fill one of those empty slots. And when he came, he got my case. So he denied everything that I had filed, and the Seventh Circuit affirmed it. So I ended up getting a time cut a couple of times for just, education. And stuff like that.
Right. Any other questions? Yes.
I was going to ask, following along the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, there were many people who were arrested on the day of the protest, who were not only horribly mistreated in the prison buses, but many people remained detained, even though all they were doing was peacefully protesting. Do you think that they're almost doing this as a threat to protest? Like, if you protest, we're gonna jail you, take you away, or we're going to, use our big, prison and jail complexes to, try to scare you off.
Yes. I will give an example. The protests that went on college and university campuses throughout this country. What happened at Kent State, and then the support that they got concerning that massacre that took place on May 4th, colleges had to shut down across the country. That was a major blow to the capitalist system, because the people that was in college at that time, those were the new oppressors that they was training. And the new oppressors threw off that capitalist education that they were receiving, then that was like a direct threat. So they had to come up with other I can't say solutions, strategies and tactics of squashing anything that looks like that. Yes. It's like that, right? I've been to different colleges, universities throughout the Midwest, all around the Midwest. And it's the same. They have a direct police presence on every campus. You cannot park anywhere if you're not a student and you got a pass. It's almost like doing a slave plantation. You couldn't get caught out on the road if you didn't have a pass. It's the same system. It's been modified.
Cole?
Yeah. So obviously you're out now.
I'm sorry, Cole.
Yeah.
So this will be the last question, everybody. It's supposed to end at 7.
So you're out today, but there are obviously a lot of other political prisoners who are still, in the system, facing the death penalty, or just, being locked away for the rest of their lives. What can we, young people or otherwise, do in this fight against incarceration and political repression?
Get in contact with those prisoners that are still there. All of them have some type of defense committee or support committee, and they have different things, whether it's compassionate release or whatever it may be, because of their age, and ask them what can be done to help, and they can give you a direct answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so in answer to what you asked, Cole, there are flyers out there on the table that we made up, and it's got websites for Sundiata Kohli's Freedom Campaign, Jamil Al-Amin, Leonard Peltier, and then Jericho website. Jericho is like a clearinghouse. It's a pro-political prisoner organization, and they have information on all of the political prisoners that are still in. So yeah, I agree with what Zolo said, and please pick up one of the flyers if it's just writing. Oh, you have one. Can you hold it up? Can you show folks? Yeah, it's just a basic little, if you want to write to a prisoner, if you want to be part of a campaign to help free a prisoner. And I'll tell you, the thing is, at this point, for these elderly political prisoners who are so committed, it's really a humanitarian campaign. There are humanitarian campaigns that are being waged to free them, because Sundiata Kohli, he has early stage dementia. Mumia Abu Jamal, he's had all kinds of very difficult illnesses. I mean, these are older people who've been in prison for, most of them, more than 40 years, in their 60s, 70s, 80s. So, yeah, please, if you're moved to do so, learn more about the prisoners, learn more about one prisoner who may grab you for whatever reason. Please pick up a flyer and help out.
Yeah, break the isolation. We got to bring it out in the open.
I can add the SNCC people, I'm terrible with names, from Youngstown, and they've spoken here, and I wish I could remember the names. But anyway, she was always called the grandmother because she was always working with prisoners in Youngstown.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
there's always work you can do, yeah.
And at this point, it's pure vengeance on the part of the government. It's just, as Zolo said, the political prisoners, for the same crimes other people have served many fewer years. They're really killing these political prisoners by just keeping them in jail, and it's really horrific. And you use the word terrorist, you use the word, whatever you want to use, and all of a sudden the person's not a human being. Well, and I know, this is a friendly audience, but I still want to say, these are human beings. They're people with families, and some of them, speaking of SNCC, they started out in, was was it Sundiata? I was just reading today, you know, one of them started out in Freedom Summer in 1964 in the Civil Rights Movement. So, you know, people go through a process. Anyway, they're really mistreated, and it's one of the biggest kept secrets, you know, the existence of U.S. political prisoners. And so, yeah, find it within your heart to help out, or within your political analysis, that this is an important thing to do for people who went before in the movement and are being persecuted for it. You know, please get involved.
Another thing, we formed the unities, or working relationships with other organizations. We formed the coalitions, and it was the coalitions that actually brought things together and gave us more strength.
Yeah, I just want to point out that there were two women who went into the House of Representatives gallery with guns in the 1950s. I forget the year.
Lolita LeBron with the other Puerto Rican
Yeah,
nationalists.
Puerto Rican independents.
Right.
They're still in prison. And those white guys who attacked our government, I'm not being charged with treason, insurrections.
Yeah.
Only a handful are being charged with sedition. Most of them are like just getting a couple days to a couple weeks in prison, and that is such a miscarriage of justice.
You are totally right about the hypocrisy. I will say an example of the power of movements to free political prisoners. Actually, Lolita LeBron and those, and even the Puerto Ricans who were arrested in 1981. There was like the next generation, the Puerto Rican independence movement, because of the power of the Puerto Rican independence movement and the unity they built with other people, largely on humanitarian grounds too. All of their prisoners are out, including Oscar Lopez Rivera, who was in for a long time.
Do you guys need more time?
So, but you're right. It's so duplicitous how people from different walks of life or movements are treated. Well, thank you very much.